The morning fog still clung to the streets when David Carter pulled his old pickup truck into the parking lot of First Meridian Private Bank's downtown branch. The truck was a 1997 model, faded blue with a cracked side mirror held together by electrical tape, and it sat conspicuously between a sleek black Mercedes and a polished silver Audi, in a lot that had clearly never hosted anything quite so weathered. David stepped out slowly, the way a man does when his knees have logged too many hard years. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, the kind with reinforced elbows that comes from a hardware store, not a boutique dark jeans with a slight wear at the right knee, and a pair of brown leather boots so old that the heels had been resoled at least twice. His hair was slightly long, combed but not styled. He carried no briefcase, no portfolio, no wristwatch that anyone would glance at twice. He looked, to any casual observer, like a man who had stopped at the wrong address. Inside the branch, the atmosphere was entirely different. First Meridian's downtown location had been recently renovated, marble floors, low ambient lighting. The kind of silence that felt engineered rather than natural. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something citrusy, pumped in from hidden vents. Staff moved with practiced precision, adjusting name placards and straightening already straight pamphlets on glass display stands. The branch manager, a nervous man named Gerald Holloway, had sent 2 reminder emails that morning alone, reminding his team that today was an inspection day. The regional director was not coming. Someone more important was. Victoria Hayes, the newly appointed chief executive officer of First Meridian Private Bank, was scheduled to make a personal visit to 3 branches that week. And this was the first stop. Everyone had heard the stories. Victoria Hayes, 38 years old, the youngest CEO in the bank's 104-year history, did not tolerate inefficiency, aesthetic disorder, or staff who failed to project the brand's image of exclusivity. Gerald had told his team to look sharp. Most of them had stayed late the night before. David pushed through the glass door and stepped inside. A teller near the entrance glanced up immediately, and something shifted almost imperceptibly behind her eyes, a flicker of calculation, the kind that happens before a single word is spoken. She looked at his jacket. She looked at his boots. She offered a smile that was technically a smile, then looked back down. A young associate near the private wealth desk turned subtly and murmured something to the colleague beside him. No one moved to greet David. He walked to the reception counter and waited, his hands resting on the marble surface with the quiet patience of a man who has waited for far more important things than a bank teller. After nearly 2 minutes, a receptionist approached and asked, in a tone calibrated to be polite without being warm, whether she could help him. David told her, simply, that he had an appointment with his financial advisor, a man named Thomas Ellison, and that he wanted to review some movement on his investment portfolio. The receptionist typed something, frowned slightly at her screen, and then informed him that Miss Ellison had taken an unexpected medical leave and would be out for the rest of the week. She asked whether he wanted to reschedule. David said he would prefer to wait and speak with whoever was managing Mr. Ellison's accounts in his absence. The receptionist told him that someone would be with him shortly and directed him to a sitting area near the window. David sat. He did not pull out a phone. He did not fidget. He simply sat in the leather chair by the window with his hands loosely folded in his lap and looked out at the street, where the morning was beginning to warm and the fog was pulling back from the glass towers above. A few staff members glanced at him with the kind of studied casualness that is actually quite deliberate. One whispered to another. No one brought him water, though there was a carafe on a stand not 8 feet away. It was then that a change swept through the room like a current. The side entrance opened, and Victoria Hayes walked in. She moved the way powerful people learn to move, not quickly, but with a quality of intention that makes a room adjust around her. Victoria Hayes was tall, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse. Her dark hair pinned back with the kind of precision that suggests a stylist was involved. She wore a watch that retailed for more than most of her tellers made in a year. Her eyes moved across the room with calm efficiency, the way a surgeon's eyes move across a tray of instruments, noting what was present, what was absent, what was out of place. Gerald Holloway materialized at her side instantly, slightly breathless. She acknowledged him with the faint nod of someone acknowledging furniture. Her gaze continued its sweep across the branch floor, noting two tellers who appeared to be chatting, a pamphlet display that was not aligned to standard, a customer at the far left window who had been waiting too long without acknowledgement. And then her eyes landed on David Carter. He was sitting in the client reception area, perfectly still, in his canvas work jacket, with his worn boots planted flat on the marble floor. He looked, and this was the word that formed in Victoria's mind: wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, but simply, categorically wrong for this space. First Meridian's private banking clients drove cars that cost more than most homes. They wore suits that were tailored. They did not sit in the client area in work jackets that came from hardware stores. Victoria turned to Gerald and kept her voice low, but not low enough. She asked, "Who is that man? And what is he doing here?" Gerald, flustered, admitted that he wasn't entirely certain the reception team had checked him in, and apparently he was waiting for someone to handle a matter regarding an account. Victoria pressed, "What kind of account?" Gerald guessed that the man might have wandered in to inquire about a small personal loan, or perhaps had confused this branch with a retail banking location down the street. It wouldn't be the first time. Victoria's expression settled into something that was not quite impatience and not quite contempt, but lived somewhere in the space between. She handed her portfolio to Gerald and walked toward David. David noticed her approach. He noticed the way the other staff seemed to straighten slightly as she moved, the way the room's ambient noise dimmed by a fraction. He watched her stop in front of him, and he saw in her expression, experienced at reading people, the particular quality of someone who has already decided what they are looking at. He waited. Victoria looked down at him for a moment before speaking, and her tone, when she spoke, had the precise timbre of someone doing a small charity. She asked whether he needed assistance finding something, and whether perhaps he had come to the wrong location, since this branch specialized in private wealth management and typically served a clientele with very particular. She paused just long enough to be meaningful financial profiles. David held her gaze calmly. He said no. He had not come to the wrong location. He said he was waiting to speak with someone about his investment portfolio, and that his usual advisor was unavailable. He said it plainly, without embellishment, without defensiveness. Victoria blinked once. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth moved. The sound she made was not a full laugh. It was something more contained and, in some ways, more devastating: a brief exhale of amusement, the kind reserved for moments of harmless absurdity. A few staff members nearby heard it and glanced over, and one of the younger associates near the wealth desk actually smiled before catching herself. Victoria recovered her composure quickly. But the sound had already happened, and David had heard it, and every person in earshot had heard it, and the air in the room had changed in the way that air changes when something is said that cannot be unsaid. She crossed her arms loosely and said, in a voice that was almost conversational, almost kind, almost but not quite respectful, "An investment portfolio." She let the word sit there for a moment. She said, "Do you understand what kind of institution this is? First, Meridian does not maintain standard retail accounts. Our clients hold portfolios in excess of $25 million at minimum. This is not the kind of place where walk-ins come to discuss." She glanced briefly at his jacket. General financial planning. David did not move. He did not shift his weight, did not clear his throat, did not look away. His expression was the expression of a man who has been underestimated so many times that it has long since stopped producing any particular feeling in him. He said, quietly and without inflection, "I'm aware of what kind of institution this is. I've been a client here for 11 years. Victoria stared at him. There was a pause, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, in which the branch was very quiet. Then she said, with a patience that was paper-thin, "Sir, I think there may be some confusion. Our client relations team would be happy to review your account status and direct you to the appropriate." And David said, "I'm not confused. I'd like to speak to whoever is responsible for managing accounts in Thomas Ellison's absence." That's all. There was something in the way he said it, not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of absolute steadiness that made one of the senior tellers look up from her screen and keep her eyes there. Victoria straightened. She said, "People who belong in rooms like this one know their place, sir. I'd encourage you to consider whether you've wandered somewhere you're not meant to be." She said it with a smile. That was the thing. She said it with a smile. What happened in the next 30 seconds was something several staff members would replay in their minds for months afterward. David Carter sat very still for a moment after Victoria finished speaking. The branch was almost silent, the kind of silence that descends when everyone in a room is holding their breath and pretending not to. Then David looked at Victoria Hayes with an expression of such complete, untroubled calm that it seemed to baffle her slightly. Not a smile, not a glare, simply a look of someone evaluating a situation with perfect clarity. He said, "Are you sure you want to continue this conversation the way you're having it?" His voice was level, quiet, almost gentle. The question was not a threat. It was something more careful than a threat. Victoria's expression shifted briefly. Something moved across her face that might have been uncertainty, quickly replaced by the more familiar architecture of authority. She said she was quite sure, and she gestured slightly toward Raymond, the branch's head of security, who was standing near the entrance. Raymond, a large man who had worked at First Meridian for 12 years and prided himself on reading rooms, moved a step closer but did not fully approach. He, too, was watching David's face. David looked at Victoria for one more moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and withdrew a phone, a basic smartphone in a rubber case, the kind of phone that costs $80, and he made a call. He did not step away. He did not lower his voice. He said, when the call connected, "This is David Carter, account number ending 7741. I need to speak with whoever is managing Mr. Ellison's portfolio clients this week." Then, "Yes, thank you." He said nothing else. He ended the call and placed the phone on the armrest of the leather chair and returned to the same position of quiet, hands loosely in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. Victoria watched this with an expression of faint dismissal. She said something under her breath to Gerald about waiting for a security review of client verification and turned away. The branch resumed its ambient noise. Staff returned to their tasks. Everything appeared to be exactly as it had been. It was not. 14 minutes passed. The branch settled back into its pre-inspection rhythm. The soft sounds of keyboards, the low murmur of telephone conversations, the occasional soft chime of a transaction completing. Gerald Holloway checked his watch twice. The junior associate near the private wealth desk was helping a client with a routine query. Raymond had returned to his post near the entrance. Victoria was at the branch manager's office reviewing operational metrics, a coffee in her hand. David Carter sat in the same chair, in the same posture, and waited. Then Gerald Holloway's phone rang. He answered it at his desk, visible through the glass partition of his office, and within 5 seconds every person who could see his face knew that something had changed. The color left his cheeks in a way that was almost clinical. A sudden, total absence of blood from the surface. He stood up from his chair slowly, the way a man stands when his legs have become uncertain. He was nodding into the phone, saying yes, yes, of course, absolutely, right away. He hung up and stood for a moment looking at David Carter through the glass. Then he straightened his tie with both hands in a gesture so automatic and unconscious that it seemed to happen without his awareness. And he walked out onto the branch floor. He walked to David. Not to Victoria. Not to his desk. Directly to David. He spoke quietly, with a deference that was so pronounced it was almost physical. It had a weight to it, a gravity. He said, "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for the wait. We've contacted our regional private banking team, and they'll be joining us shortly. In the meantime, may I offer you something, coffee, water, anything at all?" His voice had the quality of a man performing a very rapid internal reassessment of everything he had witnessed in the past half hour. Two tellers nearest the reception area exchanged a glance. The junior associate near the wealth desk looked up from his client and kept looking. Raymond, from across the room, watched Gerald Holloway stand with his shoulders slightly rounded before the man in the canvas jacket. And something in Raymond's expression became very still. Victoria emerged from the branch manager's office with her coffee. She saw Gerald at the client seating area. She saw the way he was standing. She began to cross the room. Outside, on the street, the first of the cars arrived. There were 3 of them, black SUVs, immaculate, with tinted rear windows. They pulled up to the curb in front of the branch with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested they had practiced it, or at least that the people inside them moved through the world in a way that left no room for disorder. Through the large glass windows of the branch, the staff could see the vehicles, and a low current of awareness began to move through the room. A door opened. Then another. The men who stepped out were dressed in dark suits, not the off-the-rack variety, but the kind with a particular fall and drape that announces its own price without naming it. There were 4 of them, plus a woman in a gray blazer carrying a leather folio. They moved through the front entrance of the branch in a loose formation, and the first thing every person in the room noticed was that they were not looking at the teller windows, or the display stands, or the branch layout. They were looking at one thing. They were looking at the man in the leather chair by the window. The man who stepped forward was Marcus Webb, First Meridian's regional director of private wealth for the entire Northeastern Division. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, and had been with the bank for 23 years. Behind him was a woman named Catherine Briel, the bank's head of client relations at the national level. The others were senior staff from the private banking division. They crossed the branch floor and stopped in front of David Carter, and Marcus Webb extended his hand with the particular quality of deference that one human being extends to another when they understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that the person before them holds significant power over their professional lives. He said, "Mr. Carter, thank you for your patience. I want to offer my personal apologies for any inconvenience today. We came as quickly as we could." David stood and shook the hand of Marcus Webb, and then of Catherine Briel, and nodded to the others. He said it was fine. He said he simply needed to address some matters regarding his portfolio. Victoria Hayes had stopped moving. She was standing approximately 12 feet away, holding her coffee, and the expression on her face was one that her staff had never seen before, not in any meeting, not in any difficult client conversation, not in any of the 3 prior branches she had visited that week. It was the expression of someone who has just understood that the floor they were standing on is not the floor they thought it was. The room around her had rearranged itself entirely, and she had not been consulted. Marcus Webb turned to look at her. He said, "Miss Hayes." His voice was neutral, but carried something beneath its surface. He said, "Perhaps you'd like to join us." The conference room at the back of the branch had a long glass table, 8 chairs, and a credenza against one wall with a second coffee service on it. Marcus Webb sat at one end. David Carter sat at the other. Catherine Briel and the remaining staff arranged themselves along the sides. Victoria was seated, though she had not been given a choice about it. Gerald Holloway hovered near the door, pale, unsure whether he was meant to be present. Marcus nodded at him, and he came in and sat at the far end. Marcus spoke first. He looked around the room with the careful expression of a man who needs to understand what happened before he can determine what to do about it. He said, "Would someone like to walk me through what occurred in the branch this morning?" He did not phrase it as a question. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the kind that forms when multiple people in a room are calculating risk simultaneously. Then one of the senior tellers, a woman named Patricia, who had been with the branch for 9 years, spoke. Her voice was steady. She recounted what she had observed. The moment David had checked in at reception, the wait, the approach by Miss Hayes, the conversation that had taken place in the seating area, the tone of the exchange, the words that had been used. She did not editorialize. She simply described what had happened with the quiet precision of a witness who understands the importance of accuracy. Marcus did not look at Victoria while Patricia spoke. He looked at the table. When Patricia finished, he asked whether there was security footage covering the client seating area. Gerald confirmed there was. Marcus said he would want to review it. Then he looked at David and said, "Mr. Carter, Would you like to describe your experience today? In your own words? David said he would keep it brief. He said he had come to the branch to discuss his portfolio in the absence of Mr. Ellison. He said he had waited without complaint. He said that a member of bank leadership had approached him, had questioned his presence in the branch, had made a series of comments that implied he did not belong there, had laughed when he mentioned his investment account, and had made a remark suggesting that people of means understand their place. He said all of this with the same flat, patient tone he had used throughout the morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He said what happened, and then he stopped. The room was quiet. Victoria opened her mouth. She said, "I wasn't aware." She stopped. Tried again. "I had no way of knowing." The sentence didn't complete itself either. She was a woman who had spent 15 years mastering the architecture of language in high-stakes rooms, who could construct a defense from almost any material, and for the first time in recent memory, she found herself with nothing to build with. Marcus said, quietly, "Mr. Carter's total deposits with First Meridian are in excess of $500 million. He has been a client of this bank for 11 years. He is our third largest individual depositor in this region." He let those words land at their own pace. He did not need to add anything to them. What happened after Marcus stated the number was something that could only be described as a kind of stillness, the particular stillness of a room in which every person is processing something that has fundamentally altered the information available to them. Patricia, the senior teller, looked at her hands. The junior associate had gone very red. Gerald Holloway appeared to be looking at a point on the wall that contained no particular feature of interest. Catherine Briel was writing something in her folio, and had been writing since before Marcus finished speaking. And whatever she was writing was not good news for anyone in that room. Victoria Hayes sat with her coffee cup still held in front of her, though she was no longer aware of holding it. David watched all of this without expression. He had seen versions of this room before, the room in which people who had dismissed him realized their mistake. It was not a room he enjoyed being in. There was nothing satisfying about the specific quality of discomfort that comes from watching people feel ashamed of themselves. He was a man who had built his wealth over 3 decades through work that was mostly invisible to people like the ones sitting around this table, and he had long ago stopped expecting the world to see him clearly. What he had not stopped expecting was to be treated with basic human decency, and this morning that expectation had been violated in a particularly public way. And so he was here. Marcus asked whether the footage review was something the bank could initiate immediately. Gerald confirmed it could be. Marcus said they would proceed. He looked at Victoria again, and this time he held the look a moment longer than necessary. And she met his eyes, and held them because not meeting them would have been worse. The footage review was not, everyone in the room understood, for the purpose of discovering what had happened. Everyone in the room already knew what had happened. The footage review was documentation. It was the formal record that would be consulted in the days ahead when decisions were made. Victoria understood this. Catherine Briel, still writing in her folio, also understood this. David said, "I'd like to share something, if I may." Marcus said, "Of course." David said it quietly, directed not at any one person in particular but at the room itself, as though he were speaking to the air in the space between all of them. He said he had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a house with no insulation and a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained hard. He said his father had worked in the mines until his lungs gave out when David was 14, and after that David had done every kind of work that existed in a county where the work was mostly physical and the pay was modest, and the pride in doing it was the only compensation that remained constant. He had laid pipe and poured concrete and driven trucks and repaired equipment and learned how to see in systems and patterns what other people saw as isolated problems. He had moved to Pittsburgh at 22 with $1,100 in a savings account and a notebook full of ideas about industrial supply chain logistics. He had built a company from a single truck and a storage unit, and that company had eventually become something that required a private banking relationship to manage. He said none of this with any heat. He said it the way you might describe a route you drove a long time ago, factually, without seeking anything from the listener. He said, "I never changed how I dress, not because I can't, but because I decided a long time ago that I didn't want the way I looked to be the reason people treated me well. I wanted to know whether people treated everyone the same. He paused. Now I know. He said something else after that pause, and the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it clearly. He said that his father had died without ever walking into a room like this one, without ever having occasion to, and also without ever having wanted to, because the men and women his father had known all his life were people who had never been invited into rooms like this, and they had learned, across generations, not to stand in doorways where they suspected they were not welcome. He said that the specific quality of what Victoria Hayes had said to him that morning, the smile, the glance at his jacket, the suggestion that people of substance understand their place was not a new thing. It was a very old thing, dressed in new language. It was the voice of every door that had ever been held slightly closed. Every waiting room, where the wrong kind of person was made to wait longer, every institution that had perfected the art of exclusion through manner rather than policy. He was not angry about it, he said. He had grown past anger about it a long time ago, but he was not willing to pretend it hadn't happened, and he was not willing to let an institution that called itself a partner to its clients continue to operate with a culture that treated some people as ornaments and others as obstacles. He had enough experience with the world to know that the way a bank treated the man in the canvas jacket was a far more accurate measure of its character than the way it treated the man in the tailored suit. Anyone could treat a suit well. The question was always what happened to everyone else. The silence after David finished lasted long enough that it had a quality, not uncomfortable, exactly, but weighted. Several people in the room had the specific expression of individuals who are feeling something they have not felt in a professional setting before. One of the junior staff near the door had blinked several times in rapid succession and was now very deliberately studying something on the table. Gerald Holloway had both his hands flat on the surface in front of him, in the posture of a man who is using the physical world to anchor himself. Patricia, the senior teller, had been watching David with an expression of quiet recognition. The expression of someone who has heard a story that rhymes with something they already knew. Victoria Hayes had put her coffee cup down. She was looking at David, and the architecture of her face had undergone a change that was visible even to the people on the periphery of the room. The calculation, the authority, the particular calibration of expression that she had spent years constructing all of it, was still there in its structural form, but it was no longer animated by the energy that had been driving it. She said his name. She said, "Mr. Carter." And then she said, "I owe you an apology." She said it without the usual apparatus, no qualifications, no passive constructions, no framing that redistributed responsibility. She said, "What I said to you this morning was wrong. I made an assumption about who you were based on how you looked, and I made it publicly, and I said things that were unkind and dismissive. I'm sorry." She did not look away while she said it, and that took something, and David recognized that it did. He watched her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Marcus intervened before the silence could settle again. He said there were matters that needed to be addressed beyond the interpersonal dimension. He said First Meridian had a responsibility to all of its clients and, more broadly, to every person who walked through its doors to provide service that was consistent regardless of appearance, presentation, or any other external marker of perceived status. He said that the events of this morning had revealed a gap between the institution's stated values and what had occurred on its floor, and that gap required a substantive response. He looked at David. He said, "Mr. Carter, I want to ask you directly, what outcome would you consider appropriate?" David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not interested in punishing anyone." He said it plainly. "That's not why I'm here. I stayed because I thought something useful might come from not walking away." He said he would keep his accounts at First Meridian, assuming the bank was willing to commit to certain changes. He said he wanted to see a formal client services review conducted at all branches, with particular attention to how clients were treated at first contact, regardless of their appearance. He said he wanted staff training that addressed unconscious assumptions about who belongs in what space. He said he wanted to see accountability for leadership behavior that set the tone for how that culture operated. He said this, and then he leaned back in his chair and said nothing more. Marcus nodded. He said, "Those are reasonable requests, and I want you to know they will be treated seriously." not as checkbox items. He said that effective immediately, pending a formal review process, Miss Hayes's operational responsibilities at the branch level would be suspended while the incident was evaluated. Victoria did not react to this visibly. She simply looked at the table. Marcus said the bank's client services framework would be reviewed at the regional level over the following 30 days, and that he would personally oversee the training initiative. Catherine Briel closed her folio. The decisions made in that conference room in the days that followed were neither simple nor comfortable. First Meridian's board convened an internal review within 48 hours of the incident. The security footage was clear, the witness accounts were consistent, and the documentation prepared by Catherine Briel left little room for alternative interpretation. Victoria Hayes was formally suspended from her CEO duties, pending a comprehensive evaluation of her conduct and the broader cultural indicators that the incident had surfaced. The board made clear that the suspension was not a procedural formality. There would be a genuine assessment of how a leadership culture that produced this kind of behavior had been allowed to develop, and what responsibility rested at the executive level. The training initiative David had requested was not a small thing. It took 3 months to design, and 6 more to roll out across the bank's Northeast regional branches, and it was not a half-day workshop but a structural overhaul of how client services were conceptualized at every level. The curriculum addressed first contact assumptions, the language of exclusivity, and how it could harden into dismissal. The difference between serving high-value clients and treating all other people as lesser. Gerald Holloway, who had the particular misfortune of being present for the entire incident, became something of an unlikely advocate for the initiative, partly from genuine remorse, and partly because he understood that the most effective response to having witnessed something he should have interrupted was to build something that made it harder to happen again. He facilitated 12 sessions in the first year. Patricia, the senior teller, received a formal commendation for her testimony. She had told the truth in a room that contained her CEO, her regional director, and a man with $500 million in deposits. And she had told it plainly, and without embellishment, and the commendation noted that this was precisely the kind of professional integrity the institution needed to protect and encourage. Victoria Hayes returned to a different role at the bank, one that did not carry the public-facing authority of the CEO position. The board's determination was that she had the technical capability the bank needed, but had demonstrated a failure of values at the leadership level that required remediation before expanded responsibility could be restored. She was assigned to work on internal risk and regulatory compliance thorough, critical work, invisible to clients. Some people in the industry read this as a demotion. Others, who understood the politics of large institutions more precisely, understood it as something else. A second chance that had been deliberately designed to be uncomfortable because the people who had designed it believed, perhaps too generously, that discomfort was something she could learn from. She did, eventually. But that is a longer story than the one that began on the morning David Carter walked through the front door of a branch that was expecting someone else. What is worth noting, however, is the particular quality of the shift that the incident produced not just in Victoria Hayes, but in the institution around her. Large organizations change slowly, and they change reluctantly, and the changes that stick are not the ones announced in press releases, but the ones that alter the small, daily, mostly invisible behaviors of the people who constitute the organization from the inside. A teller who hesitates for a moment before forming a judgment. A branch manager who asks himself whether the client waiting in the chair has been offered water. A senior advisor who notices the particular way a client is greeted at the door and decides to say something about it. These are not dramatic changes. They do not make the news, but they are the architecture of a different kind of institution, and they are built one small decision at a time, by people who were in a room when something happened and decided, afterward, to carry what they had witnessed with them. David left the bank that afternoon the same way he had arrived alone, through the front entrance, in his canvas jacket and his twice-resoled boots. The afternoon light had shifted since morning, the fog long gone, and the street had the particular quality of a city in early autumn. Sharp-edged, clear-aired, briefly beautiful before the cold came in. He walked to his truck in the parking lot and stood for a moment with his hand on the door, looking at nothing in particular. Inside the branch, Something had changed in the way that spaces change after a significant event, not in their physical arrangement, but in their atmosphere, the way a room feels differently after it has been the site of something important. Gerald Holloway was at his desk, looking at a legal pad on which he had written 3 pages of notes. The junior associate had not said anything to anyone for the better part of 2 hours. Patricia was at her window, working steadily, her expression composed and thoughtful. The branch was doing what branches do, processing transactions, answering questions, maintaining the ordinary machinery of financial life, but it was doing it with a slightly different quality of attention. When David pushed through the glass door of the branch that afternoon to collect a document that had been prepared for him, and then turned to leave, a thing happened that Gerald had not organized or requested or even anticipated. Patricia stood up from her window. The junior associate stood. The 2 tellers at the far wall stood. Gerald, who saw them standing, stood. The security officer near the entrance stood straight. One by one, quietly, without direction, the staff of First Meridian's downtown branch rose from their chairs and their stations, and they stood as David Carter walked through the room and toward the exit, and they did not do it because he had $500 million in an account. They did it because of the way he had sat in a leather chair for 40 minutes and absorbed contempt without returning it, and then had walked into a conference room and asked for nothing, except that people be treated with basic dignity, and then had walked back out again, still wearing the same jacket, still carrying the same phone in its rubber case, unchanged. David did not pause when he noticed them standing. He nodded once, a single, brief acknowledgement that was neither proud nor performative, but simply present. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the afternoon. Behind him, through the glass, the staff of First Meridian's downtown branch settled back into their stations, and the ordinary business of the day resumed, and the branch hummed along as it always had, though each person in it carried something different now than they had carried when the morning began. Some of them would not be able to name it precisely for some time. Others would be able to name it immediately, but would find it difficult to put into words that felt adequate. Patricia, at her window, would think about it during her drive home, and would find herself explaining it to her husband at dinner that night by saying simply that she had seen someone behave with more dignity under pressure than anyone she had ever observed in a professional setting, and that it had made her want to examine what she herself was made of. The junior associate would spend the next several months reconsidering some of the assumptions he had been carrying since business school, assumptions that had felt like sophistication at the time, and felt considerably less sophisticated in retrospect. Gerald Holloway would write in his personal journal that evening, a habit he had not maintained in years, and would fill 3 pages before he stopped. And the last sentence he wrote was, "He never raised his voice once." The truck started on the second try, the way it always did. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street, and the city continued around him the way cities do, indifferent and enormous, and full of people moving through it on their separate trajectories, none of them knowing what had just happened inside one glass-fronted building on one unremarkable block. David drove north through the traffic, past the construction sites and the coffee shops and the office towers with their rows of lit windows, and he thought about a house in Harlan County where the roof had leaked in 3 places, and about his father, and about all the work that had happened in the long space between that house and this day. He thought about his daughter, who was 12 years old and had no memory of the house, who had grown up with everything he had not had, who asked him sometimes why he didn't buy nicer things since they could afford them. He thought about what he told her, which was that the point was never the things. He thought about the way that lesson had landed this morning. Confirmed once more, in the most concrete way imaginable. He did not think about Victoria Hayes, not with anger and not with satisfaction. He had said what he had come to say, and it had been heard, and the institution had been put on notice, and something had shifted in a room that had needed shifting. That was enough. The greatest statement a person can make about their own worth is not the fury with which they respond to being underestimated, but the calm with which they decline to be destroyed by it. The greatest lesson about power is that the most enduring kind is quiet. It does not need to announce itself, does not need to be recognized in the moment, does not need the confirmation of a room full of people finally seeing you. David Carter had known what he was worth for a very long time before this morning. He had always known it. The morning had not told him anything new about himself. It had only revealed something about the room. He merged onto the highway, and the city fell away behind him, and he drove home. The radio was off. The heater hummed at its lower setting. Outside, the highway ran through the late afternoon suburbs, the strip malls and the service roads, and the overpasses with their layers of old paint and older rust, and then out into the broader open country where the sky was bigger, and the light hit the fields at a long angle, and turned everything, briefly golden before it went. David drove through all of it the way he had driven through 100 similar afternoons, without hurrying, without the particular restlessness that comes from needing to be somewhere other than where you are. He was a man at ease in his own company, and this had always been one of his more valuable assets, though it appeared on no balance sheet. The truth that David Carter carried with him, and that the morning had demonstrated with a clarity that no management training manual could have engineered, is not a complicated truth, though it is one that seems to require repeated demonstration before it is believed. The value of a person is not legible in the thread count of their clothing, or the nameplate on their car, or the particular precision of their haircut. These things are signals, and signals can be manufactured, and the people who rely on signals to determine how to treat other people will always be at risk of this specific and humiliating error. The error of dismissing someone who turned out to be exactly who they said they were. There is a version of this story in which David Carter is not a man with $500 million in a private banking account. There is a version in which he is simply a man who drives an old truck and wears a canvas jacket and wants to be spoken to with ordinary respect. That version of the story ends differently in a legal sense. But the moral content of the story does not change at all. Victoria Hayes's mistake was not, ultimately, that she misjudged a wealthy client. Her mistake was that she looked at a human being and decided, in the space of 2 seconds, that he was worth less than the room he was standing in. The $500 million was merely the mechanism by which that mistake became visible. Without it, she might have spent the rest of her career making the same calculation and never encountering a consequence. But the capacity for this kind of error does not begin with wealth. It begins with the habit of sorting people by their surfaces, of treating the visible presentation of a person as their actual content. That habit, unchallenged, becomes culture, and culture, unchallenged, becomes the normal operating procedure of an institution. First Meridian had allowed that culture to develop, quietly, in the space between its stated values and its daily practice, and it had required a man who was willing to sit patiently in a leather chair and make a single phone call to bring it into the light. This is, in one sense, a story about money. The $500 million is what made the room turn. It is what caused 3 black SUVs to arrive within 14 minutes, what brought Marcus Webb across town with his team, what produced the particular quality of attentiveness that followed. Take the money out of the story, and the morning would likely have ended differently. David would have been asked to leave, or would have left on his own, and no conference would have been convened, and no footage would have been reviewed, and no training initiative would have been built in the aftermath. This is worth acknowledging honestly. Money is a form of power, and power produces consequences, and this story would not have had the shape it had without the particular power that David possessed. But here is the other thing. The thing that sits beside all of that, and does not go away. The question of how Victoria Hayes treated a man in a canvas jacket on a Tuesday morning is entirely separate from the question of how much money he had in his account. It was wrong before the number was revealed. It was wrong in the moment it happened, witnessed by Patricia and the junior associate and Raymond and the 2 tellers at the far wall. The money did not create the wrong. It simply ensured that the wrong had consequences. In a better world, the wrong would have had consequences regardless. In this world, a man had to have $500 million for the room to turn. That is a true thing, and it is worth sitting with. Alongside everything else, David Carter had not asked for an apology, initially. He had asked to speak to someone about his portfolio. That was all. The apology, the suspension, the training initiative, the board review, none of that had been his goal when he walked through the door. He had come to conduct routine business. The rest of it had been made necessary by other people's choices. And the response to those choices had been made possible by his own, by the decision to stay when he could have left, by the decision to be still when there was pressure to be something else, by the decision to ask for change rather than retaliation when the room had finally, definitively turned in his favor. There is a particular kind of strength, in that the strength of the person who does not need the moment of recognition to know who they are. David Carter had built his life from the material of hard work and patient vision, in places where no one was watching and no credit was being assigned, and by the time the world had arranged itself into a shape that could see him, he had long since stopped needing it to. He had learned this early. In a county where the work was mostly invisible, in a house where the roof leaked when it rained. He had carried that lesson across every mile of the distance between that house and this afternoon, and he had not put it down. Not even for a moment. Not even in a marble-floored bank branch on a foggy Tuesday morning, when a woman in a charcoal blazer had looked at his jacket and laughed. He already knew what he was worth. He had always known, and somewhere in a conference room with a long glass table, so did everyone else.